The notion of free will appears to be one of the most intuitively obvious realities of our conscious experience. We act and choose and decide, but we feel that we could have done differently. We turned left, but we could have turned right. We chose chocolate, but we could have chosen vanilla, etc. But one thing the field of psychology has demonstrated is that our intuitions about our own conscious experience are many times illusory and objectively wrong. In this video, I will attempt to demonstrate that, despite our intuitions to the contrary, we don't actually have free will. I want to begin my argument against free will by highlighting two seemingly completely different cases of psychopathy, that of Charles Whitman and that of Donta Page. I believe that surveying these two disparate cases will greatly aid in the eventual understanding that free will is illusory. Let's start with Whitman. Charles Whitman was born in 1941 and was raised in a Catholic household. Whitman had high accolades growing up and exhibited striking intelligence. After graduation, Whitman joined the Marines, where he excelled as a sharpshooter, and 3 years later he met and married his wife, Kathleen. A few years later, Whitman began to notice a change in his demeanor, and subsequently began to suffer from frequent and incessant migraines. He also began to have violent and aggressive thoughts, as well as uncontrollable fits of anger, and began to seek the help of physicians and psychiatrists. By this point, Whitman had been journaling his own thoughts and experiences for a number of years, and so was able to record his own behavioral and psychological decline. In one of his journal entries, Whitman stated, "I don't really understand myself these days. I'm supposed to be an average, reasonable, and intelligent young man. However, lately, I cannot recall when it started, I have been a victim of many unusual and irrational thoughts. These thoughts constantly recur, and it requires a tremendous mental effort to concentrate on useful and progressive tasks." Within a span of a year, Whitman had visited 5 different physicians and a handful of psychiatrists, to no avail. His uncharacteristically violent thoughts and aggressive disposition, as well as his unbearable headaches, persisted unmitigated. Incidentally, one of the psychiatrists that Whitman met with jotted in his own notes that, quote, "this massive muscular youth seemed to be oozing with hostility, that something seemed to be happening to him, and that he didn't seem to be himself," end quote. Again, none of the help that Whitman sought proved to be of any assistance with his condition, and so on August 1st, 1966, very early in the morning, Charles Whitman drove to his mother's house and stabbed her to death. He subsequently returned home and stabbed his wife to death. He took the time to journal his actions and even called both his mother's and his wife's place of work to call in sick for both of them. After this, he took a bundle of rifles to the University of Texas at Austin campus and climbed the main building's clock tower and began to pick off innocent civilians. He killed a total of 15 people on campus and wounded another 31 before being shot dead by police. The tragic nature of this story aside, the most intriguing events were yet to come. As investigators would later search and evaluate Whitman's belongings, they inevitably came across his journal, where his entire descent into psychopathy was well documented. Interestingly, in one of his last entries, Whitman pleaded, quote, "After my death, I wish that an autopsy would be performed on me to see if there is any visible physical disorder," end quote. An autopsy was indeed performed on Whitman, and sure enough, a brain tumor the size of a pecan was found below his thalamus and pressing against his amygdala. We'll return to Whitman's case and its implications for free will shortly. Let us now turn to the completely different and comparably tragic case of Donta Page. Donta Page was born in 1976 to a teen mother. Page's father would never be a part of his life. Page grew up in one of the lowest socioeconomic demographics in Washington, D.C., and as he grew up, he had documented conduct disorder in elementary school as well as ADHD. Page fell into a lifestyle of crime early on. By his teens, he was committing burglary and armed robbery, and at 18 years old, he was sentenced to 20 years in prison. However, upon being released from prison at 23, Page would proceed to enter the residence of 24-year-old Peyton Tuttle in order to burglarize it, unaware that Tuttle was home. After a brief verbal confrontation, Page would proceed to rape Tuttle and violently stab her to death. Page was later caught and confessed to his crime. Page was subsequently indicted and is currently serving life in prison today. Now, I've highlighted these admittedly tragic yet different cases in order to excavate the depths of how free will fits into human psychology. For it seems that we intuitively have very different feelings about the freedom and constraints that both of these men harbored. In the case of Charles Whitman, we understand that his circumstances were unique. A brain tumor has the ability to alter one's will, one's desires, and one's dispositions. The fact that even Whitman himself noticed a sudden change in his thoughts and inclinations that were previously uncharacteristic to his psychological makeup demonstrates that he was merely a bystanding victim of his own psychological downturn, subject to that which he had no control over. After all, Whitman simply couldn't help the way the tumor altered his neurophysiology, which in turn altered his psychological dispositions. If a tumor causes one to have violent and aggressive inclinations, and if said tumor also causes one to not be able to regulate their behavior, which acts on these very inclinations, then how is Whitman not simply a victim of the sudden and unfortunate happenings in his brain? Isn't Whitman no different from an individual who, through no fault of their own, suffers a stroke and is thus subject to the hopeless effects of this neurological occurrence that are completely outside of their control? I think any rational individual would agree that Whitman's free will, if there was any semblance of it left, was severely compromised. Could he really control his violent and aggressive dispositions? Could he really have done otherwise given that the tumor was tugging on the strings of his brain? Isn't it clearly the case that Whitman would not have done what he did had he possessed a neurochemically sound brain? Now let us contrast our intuitions about Whitman with our intuitions about Donta Page. If Whitman's free will was constrained by neurological factors outside of his control, then surely Page's actions are not so volitionally exculpatory. Page had no such tumor altering his desires and inclinations. So wasn't his psychopathy all his own, part of his natural disposition, as it were? Page, unlike Whitman, had no abrupt change in his psychology. He had conduct disorders and criminal tendencies as far back as one can pinpoint, as he was already in juvenile correctional facilities by his early teens. By 18 years old, he had already received a 20-year prison sentence. Wasn't this just who Donta Page was? And wasn't it his violent and aggressive tendencies that led him to rape and murder 24-year-old Peyton Tuttle? As the prosecutor Henry Cooper stated during Page's trial, quote, Page deliberated before the crime. He deliberated after the crime about covering it up. He went back into Tuttle's apartment and killed her so he wouldn't get caught. He placed his own freedom ahead of Peyton Tuttle's life. Now, here's where we reach a turning point, because I actually believe these intuitions about Donta Page are completely misguided. I don't believe there is any difference between the cases of Charles Whitman and Donta Page. I believe that the actions and dispositions of both men were sufficiently constrained so as to rule out any coherent notion of free will on their part. And part of demonstrating this is to briefly revisit Page's upbringing, as I purposefully left out a plethora of crucial aspects of his development throughout his childhood. When Donta Page was born in 1976, his 16-year-old mother had gonorrhea during her pregnancy. By the time Page was 2 years old, he already had 5 recorded admissions to the emergency room, most for significant head trauma. Page was so consistently malnourished as a kid that he was known to rummage around in garbage cans to satiate his hunger. Page experienced constant physical abuse from his mother. She was known to shake him violently as an infant. As Page got older, she would beat him with a closed fist, whip him with the end of an electric cord, and burn him with cigarettes. Page's relationship with his mother was so damaged that he would often prefer to sleep in an abandoned building rather than stay at home. When Page was 10 years old, he was violently raped by his next-door neighbor. His subsequent ER trip revealed both rectal and internal bleeding. A few years later, he would resurface at the ER again because his mother knocked him unconscious with an iron, thereby compounding his history of severe head trauma. Does the articulation of these events not change our opinion of exactly how much free will Donta Page had? Did Page have a brain tumor that suddenly altered and constrained his dispositions and inclinations like Charles Whitman had? Well, no. But Page, through his unfortunate life experiences and trauma, had a brain that was built and shaped through years of head trauma, neglect, malnourishment, and extreme physical and sexual abuse. Page's disposition towards crime and violence is surely propagated from a damaged and malformed brain. Every act of trauma and abuse that Page experienced, even as a toddler, had a role in shaping or misshaping his neurochemistry. And the factors contributing to the construction of Page's brain don't end there. One's neurodevelopment is also built through one's genes, their fetal environment, and their socioeconomic environment growing up, all areas where Page was lacking as well. How could Page be considered to act freely if his acts are the result of dispositions and inclinations handed down to him through his neural networks that were ultimately shaped by experiences, genes, trauma, malnourishment, and abuse? Where exactly does free will enter the picture here? Neuroscientist Sam Harris articulates this point well.
Consider you're a generic murderer. Okay, his choice to commit his last murder was preceded by a long series of prior causes, a certain pattern of electrochemical activity in his brain, which was the product of prior causes, some combination of bad genes and the developmental effects of an unhappy childhood, whatever influences were impinging upon him the day he committed his crime. The moment we catch sight of this stream of causes that precede any conscious experience and reach back into childhood and beyond, or beyond the person's skin into the world, the sense of his culpability disappears. That the place where we would place our blame disappears. To say that he could have done otherwise is really to say he would have been in a different universe had he been in a different universe, or that he would have been a different person had he been a different person. Now, and as disturbing as I might find such a person's behavior, I have to admit that if I were to trade places with him, atom for atom, I would be him. And I would behave exactly as he did. And for the same reasons. There's no extra part of me that could resist the impulse to victimize innocent people.
Now, for the viewer who, despite what they've heard so far, still insists that a criminal like Donta Page has free will, I would merely ask again where free will enters the discussion in the causes that led up to Page's actions. It can't enter into the equation in Page's intent to commit the act itself, because this decision was determined by his dispositions and inclinations, which were in turn determined by the type of brain and neurophysiology that Page had. And Page's neurodevelopment was, again, determined by a multitude of forces, some of them tracing back as far as his mother's genes, completely outside his control. This point is articulated by psychologist Adrian Raine in his book, The Anatomy of Violence, where he discusses the case of Donta Page at length. Raine states, "Okay, you say, so Page has a whole bunch of risk factors for violence. Sure, he got a rough deal in life, but he's still as responsible as anyone. If an individual possesses characteristics that make him disproportionately more likely to commit violence, then he has to take responsibility for those predisposing factors. Just as an alcoholic knows he has a drinking problem and must seek out treatment, so the person at risk for violence needs to recognize those risk factors and take preventative steps to ensure that he doesn't harm others. He has a choice, and he needs to act. He is responsible. This makes good practical sense, but there's a problem with this argument. Responsibility and self-reflection are not disembodied, ethereal processes, but are instead rooted firmly in the brain. Functional imaging research has shown that the medial prefrontal cortex is centrally involved in the ability to engage in self-reflection, and it is this very area of the brain that has been repeatedly found to be structurally and functionally impaired in antisocial, violent, and psychopathic offenders. Similarly, patients who have damage to the medial prefrontal cortex are known to become irresponsible, to lack self-discipline, and to reflect less on the consequences of their actions. The very mechanisms that subserve the ability to take responsibility for one's actions were impaired in Donta Page. Keep in mind that part of Page's tragic history was his frequent trips to the ER as a toddler for significant head trauma. And even when he was a bit older, his mother would beat him with the closed fist and knocked him unconscious with an iron. See, we look at Charles Whitman's tumor firmly situated in his brain and have no problem excusing him of intentional culpability. But have you wondered what the brain of Donta Page looks like? Luckily, psychologist Adrian Rain, whom we just surveyed, was able to scan Page's brain. Here are PET scans of Page's brain on the left and a normal functioning, healthy, and developed brain on the right. You can clearly see that the brain on the right completely lights up in the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for impulse control, emotion regulation, gratification postponement, and long-term planning. The healthy brain on the right has functioning throughout the prefrontal cortex, but Page's brain is significantly impaired. His prefrontal cortex barely lights up and functions significantly less than a normal and healthy brain, which entails that his disposition towards impulse control, emotion regulation, gratification postponement, and long-term planning is significantly diminished. So again, if Page's intent is determined by his dispositions and inclinations, which ultimately derive from his neurophysiology, then how exactly is he supposed to regulate and control his aggressive and violent inclinations through the use of his brain, which doesn't have the ability to regulate emotions and control impulses? Where exactly is free will supposed to gain a foothold here? Now, if you've made it this far in the video, you might have a retort to the cases of Charles Whitman and Donta Page. After all, both Whitman and Page exhibit forms of psychopathy, and psychopathy is obviously not the norm. It's an unfortunate and unique condition that is specifically contrasted with those of us who have healthy psychological and neurological underpinnings. What Whitman and Page have is a psychological and neurological sickness that does not afflict normal individuals. So even if one were to grant that Whitman and Page lack free will due to their unique neurological circumstances, one could argue that this is not a phenomenon that we can extend to humanity as a whole. People like Whitman and Page might not have had free will, but the rest of us surely do. But do we? I mean, take any desire or inclination you might reliably have, and ask yourself why you have this desire and not another. Let's take a fairly mundane inclination, a desire to drink coffee. Let's assume for the sake of argument that you harbor such a desire. The question can then be posed regarding why you have the desire to drink coffee in the first place. What accounts for this inclination? Surely your desire is determined by something. It doesn't just pop into being from nothing. That would be randomness. So what exactly determines your affinity for coffee? Maybe you drink it every morning and desire it out of habit. Maybe you've never tried coffee before and this desire is merely part of a disposition of yours to try new things. Or perhaps you're addicted to caffeine. The point to note here again is that something counts as a determining factor for your desire. And once we understand this, the question gets pushed back to why you have an inclination and a disposition for this something in the first place. If you're the type of person who merely drinks coffee out of habit, then the question can be posed regarding what determined this habitual disposition to begin with. If instead you only have a desire to drink coffee because you've never tried coffee before, and you're the type of person to try new beverages, then the question can be posed regarding what determined you to be this type of person in the first place. And if instead you're merely someone addicted to caffeine, then obviously the question can be posed regarding what determined your addictive disposition. Your choices are determined by your dispositions and inclinations, and these dispositions and inclinations were determined by even further dispositions and inclinations. The point here is that once we begin to peel back the layers of determining factors, we will eventually begin to embark on psychological and neurological territory that you had no hand in creating. Now, the astute viewer will no doubt protest at this point that I haven't at all demonstrated a lack of free will in coffee drinkers. After all, one might have a desire to drink coffee and yet abstain from the action itself. That is, despite one having an inclination to act a certain way, one can choose not to. And even if one does drink a cup of coffee, they could have chosen not to do so. So this whole talk about being determined by one's disposition seems superficial and naive. If we can choose not to give in to our desires, which we surely can, then free will is alive and well, is it not? Well, again, I don't believe so, and allow me to demonstrate why. Let's zero in on the individual who is addicted to caffeine. So they're addicted to caffeine and thus have the desire to satiate this addiction with a cup of coffee. However, let's assume that they've turned over a new leaf. They're cognizant of their addiction and are actively working to eradicate it. So they resolve to quit coffee cold turkey in order to completely stop their ingestion of caffeine. Now, this certainly appears to be an instance of free will. A person has a desire to drink coffee, but instead makes a conscious decision of their own volition, free of any constraints, to not indulge in this desire. But herein lies the issue. The same questions we originally posed regarding a person's desire to drink coffee can now be posed of this person's desire and willpower to quit consuming caffeine. Why, for example, is this person the type of individual who wants to eradicate an addiction? For we surely know of many people who know they are addicts and yet have no such inclination to uproot this tendency. And why is this person the type of individual who has the willpower to fight their addiction? For we also surely know of many people who desire to extinguish their addiction, but simply can't garner the willpower to do so. So the point here is that if a person has desires and inclinations, and yet chooses not to act on them, this will only be at the behest of other desires and inclinations that this person harbors. So this isn't a case of a person not being determined by their desires. Rather, it's simply a case of a person's desire for X being subverted by a competing desire for Y. Having one inclination trump another inclination only entails that you have a stronger disposition for one as opposed to the other. But why does one have that disposition in the first place? We're still stuck here in a causal chain trying to infer why a person has the desires, inclinations, and dispositions they have to begin with. People make choices, sure, but their choices are ultimately determined by dispositions that they didn't pick and don't control. What determines your dispositions and inclinations? Well, the structure of your brain, for one. We know this because changing the structure of your brain changes your dispositions and inclinations. And what determines the structure of your brain? Well, a multitude of things. Your genetics, your fetal environment, your past experiences, trauma you've endured, environmental and cultural influences, your parents' marital status, your nutritional intake growing up, etc. Your neural development was predicated on things like whether your mother abstained from drinking alcohol when she was pregnant with you, how many times your parents held you versus how many times they hit you, how many times you were fed nourishing meals versus how many times you ate junk or went hungry, whether when you were a kid and walked down the street you were more likely to see a bookstore as opposed to an abandoned house, whether your family has the unfortunate luck to have a history of depression, whether your father attended your baseball games when you were a kid as opposed to never being there at all because he was incarcerated, etc. All these events and influences literally built or destroyed neural networks in your brain. Your neurophysiology is predicated on events, genes, and experiences outside of your control. And it is this neurophysiology that determines your desires and inclinations and dispositions. Sam Harris articulates this well in his book, Free Will. Take a moment to think about the context in which your next decision will occur. You did not pick your parents or the time and place of your birth. You didn't choose your gender or most of your life experiences. You had no control whatsoever over your genome or the development of your brain. And now your brain is making choices on the basis of preferences and beliefs that have been hammered into it over a lifetime by your genes, your physical development since the moment you were conceived, and the interactions you have had with other people, events, and ideas. Where is the freedom in this? So where then is your free will? At what stage in the process of the building of your neural networks to the formulation of dispositions and desires based on these neural networks to the carrying out of certain acts based on these dispositions and desires does free will shoehorn itself in? Neurologist Robert Sapolsky echoes these sentiments in his book, Determined. The intent you form, the person you are, is the result of all the interactions between biology and environment that came before, all things out of your control. Each prior influence flows without a break from the effects of the influences before. As such, there's no point in the sequence where you can insert a freedom of will that will be in that biological world, but not of it. Now, free will is most assuredly an intuitive feeling, no doubt. We certainly feel as if we could act other than we do, but if we could act other than we did, this would entail that we would have different desires and inclinations than we had, which would entail that we had a different neurophysiology than we had. So yes, you could have done otherwise if you had different dispositions and inclinations, and you could have had different dispositions and inclinations if you had a different brain. To echo Sam Harris yet again, to say that you would have acted differently in a past situation is just to say that you would have been a different person. Had Donta Page not had enormous amounts of head trauma growing up, and if he had not been sexually abused, then perhaps he would have had an optimally functioning prefrontal cortex that would have allowed him to control his violent impulses. Or maybe he wouldn't have had those impulses to begin with. If he had had his father in his life or a mother who loved him, then maybe he wouldn't have begun burglarizing and committing armed robbery as a teenager. There's an infinite amount of what-ifs that can be postulated here. Unfortunately, what-ifs don't amount to much. We don't find free will in the what-ifs. We find a lack of free will in the what-is. So Donta Page could have done differently had he not been the same person with the same experiences and the same malformed brain. And this applies not just to Donta Page or Charles Whitman, but to you and I and everyone else. From one's decision to drink coffee or not to one's decision to pursue a career as an electrician as opposed to a firefighter, and even to one's decision to commit a violent crime or not. One's decisions are ultimately made on the basis of who they are, their desires, dispositions, tendencies, and inclinations. And who they are is based on their genes, their experiences, their parents, their trauma, and their environment, and how all these factors shaped, built, and determined the structure of their brain. Now, it's important to note at this point that even a belief in a soul won't evade the issue, for you didn't construct your soul either. And even if one believes that there exists an interplay between one's soul and one's brain or mind, the causative role that exists between the two is something that you can't control and didn't have a hand in building. So no, the soul is not some volitional scapegoat here. Free will, then, is illusory. It's nowhere to be found. No matter where we attempt to place it, there always exists a preceding determining factor that traces back to causes and conditions that one had no control over. Based on the evidence we've uncovered, one who maintains belief in free will is simply one who believes that a puppet with very long strings is not really a puppet at all. And I understand that the notion of free will is a difficult belief to jettison, not only because we clearly feel as if we can act differently than we do, but also because it seems difficult to hold individuals morally accountable for their actions if they could not have done otherwise. I acknowledge this, and yet, based on the evidence we've surveyed, I cannot help but affirm the reality that free will is illusory. The notion of free will, though intuitively compelling, unravels under scrutiny. Every choice we make is tethered to a chain of causes, biological, environmental, and experiential, that we did not choose. From the mundane act of drinking coffee to the gravest of crimes, our decisions reflect the architecture of brains we did not design. We are not the authors of our wills, and thus any freedom we might imbue in such a notion is misplaced. As Arthur Schopenhauer famously said, "Man can do what he wills, but he can't will what he wills." Thanks for watching.